It began with a whisper inside the prison walls, a rumor too wild to be true. A female inmate, quiet and unassuming, had managed to do the unthinkable: seduce 5 correctional officers and infect them with HIV. Within days, she was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Suicide? Revenge? Or something far more sinister? In a system built on silence and control, one woman shattered everything. This isn't just a story about prison. It's about power, seduction, and secrets the system tried to bury. But someone always talks, and tonight we're listening. They say you never forget the face of a woman with secrets. When 32-year-old Tamara Fields stepped to the gates of Eastwood Correctional Facility in rural Texas, no one could have predicted the chaos she was about to unleash. She was quiet, calculated, cold, but behind those dark eyes was something far more dangerous, something no one at Eastwood was prepared for. Inmate number 778423. That was the number on her jumpsuit. But wouldn't be long before they all knew her name. Eastwood was a fortress, hidden in the dusty outskirts of Texas, surrounded by razor wire and silence, home to some of the state's most hardened female offenders. And yet, none of them carried the weight that Tamara did. Her file was thin, suspiciously thin. Officially, she was there for fraud and obstruction of justice. But sealed juvenile records, multiple aliases, and a psychiatric evaluation gone missing? Those details told a different story. A darker one. Tamara said nothing during intake, just the basics. No visitors, no phone call, no requests. It was like she had already accepted her place or had chosen it. She walked through those gates like she'd been there before, like she owned the place. By her second day, the guards had already started to notice her, not because she was loud, but because she wasn't. She didn't flinch when voices were raised. She didn't blink during cell searches. And somehow, she was always being watched. They called it professionalism, but it wasn't. One by one, guards began orbiting around her, checking in, making exceptions, lingering too long. Tamara never asked for anything, but she got everything. She sat alone during meals. No one dared approach her. She didn't need protection. People simply stayed away, as if something about her said, "Don't try me." The inmates felt it. The staff felt it. Something was off. And then came the yard incident. Day 3. Tamara sat on the far bench, staring into nothing. One guard stood nearby without assignment, without explanation. He later said he felt she shouldn't be left alone. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Her behavior was perfect, her record spotless. But her presence? Unshakable, like a storm cloud that wouldn't move. Just watching, waiting. Her medical screening came and went without issue. She declined to discuss her sexual history, refused an HIV test. Standard protocol would have overruled her refusal, but somehow it didn't. A clerical error, they said, but it was the kind of error that would cost lives. Because what no one knew, not the guards, not the nurses, not the warden, was that Tamara Fields had arrived at Eastwood with more than just secrets. She had a plan, and in less than 1 week, that plan was already in motion. Tamara Fields didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She didn't need to. She arrived at Eastwood Correctional Facility with nothing but silence and a stare that made people uncomfortable, a stare that studied, pierced, and disarmed. By her second week inside, things had shifted, small things that would have gone unnoticed if not for what came later. A corrections officer bringing her extra rations. Another one stationed near her cell a little too often. A female guard slipping her a paperback book, then returning the next day with another. No one said anything, but everyone felt it. A slow burn, not a spark, but it was growing. Tamara didn't beg for attention. She didn't play the usual prison games. Instead, she became the center of gravity in a place designed to suppress individuality. People were drawn in and didn't know why. Officer David Carver was the first to fall in. He was known around Eastwood as disciplined, former military, quiet, a stickler for rules. But with Tamara, something shifted. He began lingering near her during shifts, escorting her back to her cell without backup. stopping at her door even when there was no call. When questioned, he claimed it was concern, that she seemed anxious or vulnerable. But Tamara never filed any complaints. She never asked for help, and that vulnerability Carver described, no one else ever saw it. Then came Officer Melanie Cruz. In her late 20s, relatively new to Eastwood, recently divorced, dealing with a custody battle. Vulnerable in her own way, Tamara took notice. Their conversation started short, a question here, a thank you there, and grew into small smiles, inside jokes. Soon Melanie was slipping Tamara things she shouldn't have had. Extra soap, aspirin, books about manipulation, body language, even criminal psychology. The kind of literature inmates don't usually get their hands on. And Tamara absorbed it all. Then there was Officer Trent Whitlow. Tough, gruff, barely spoke to inmates unless necessary. But after a month of Tamara being inside, he was on night duty, and he began checking her cell twice during rounds. Every hour on the hour, no reported disruption, no incident, just checking. He wouldn't be the last. In total, 5 officers became entangled with Tamara Fields. All of them said they weren't. All of them insisted it was harmless. Some denied contact beyond what was necessary. But within 6 weeks of Tamara's arrival, all 5 had something else in common. They tested positive for HIV. At first, the prison thought it was a coincidence. A tragic one, but a coincidence nonetheless. Drug use? Past partners? But 2 of the guards were married. One had never tested positive before. All 5 had records that previously cleared them. It didn't add up. Only when Tamara was placed in medical isolation did the pattern become harder to ignore. She refused to cooperate with questions. She said nothing when asked about the guards. But she didn't have to speak. Not when her records from a prior facility in Arizona quietly surfaced. Tamara had been diagnosed HIV positive 2 years before. She had refused medication, had refused counseling, and then she vanished, skipped bail, dropped off the radar, changed her name. Her arrival at Eastwood wasn't random. She'd manipulated the system, pled out to minor charges in a rural county, without disclosing her full identity, without revealing the danger she carried. But it was more than the virus. Tamara didn't just passively infect. She planned. She targeted. She chose. Each of the 5 guards had something in common. They were emotionally compromised, lonely, divorced, isolated. And Tamara had found the crack in each of their walls and slipped right through it. One guard, who later spoke anonymously, admitted Tamara had offered him a homemade tattoo. In his words, a bonding gesture. He accepted. He didn't ask what needle she used. He didn't ask if it was clean. Another admitted she kissed him, once lightly on the neck. Just a motion, he said. Nothing more. But with HIV, just a motion is enough. Once the pattern became undeniable, the prison scrambled. Lockdowns, internal affairs, external investigators. But the damage was already spreading, and not just medically. Families of the guards demanded answers. Lawsuits began to mount. News leaked. And Tamara? She sat in isolation, her expression blank, unreadable. Never once denied it. Never once apologized. One investigator, during an off-the-record interview, said Tamara gave off a sense of satisfaction, that she wasn't just indifferent, she was pleased. When asked why she did it, Tamara refused to give a reason. But in a notebook confiscated from her cell, officials found a sentence scribbled in the margins of a worn psychology manual. You can't infect someone who's already broken. All I did was show them how far gone they really were. There were no fingerprints on the note, no date, no direct confession. But in context, it didn't matter. Tamara Fields had seduced 5 trained officers. Not for love, not for survival, for control, for revenge, or maybe just because she could. Her infections weren't accidents. They were weapons, chosen, timed, executed. And the virus? It was just a delivery method. By the time the 5th officer was officially diagnosed, Eastwood was no longer a correctional facility. It was a crime scene, Tamara had created a biological disaster inside a prison that had never seen anything like her. But what the administration didn't know, what the guards didn't suspect, was that the worst wasn't over. Because within days of her isolation, Tamara Fields would be found dead in her cell. And the questions that haunted Eastwood wouldn't end with her last breath. They were only beginning. Eastwood Correctional Facility had always operated under the illusion of control. Set deep in rural Texas, it was isolated, self-contained, and quiet. The kind of place where scandals didn't happen. Until they did. When 5 officers tested positive for HIV, the prison went into damage control. It started with whispers, guards being reassigned, inmate movement being restricted, daily routines disrupted without explanation. No one talked, but everyone knew something was wrong. Officers who had once been seen chatting with Tamara Fields vanished from the cell blocks entirely. Some took sudden leaves of absence. One resigned. Inside the walls, anxiety tightened like a noose. Inmates speculated. Some said Tamara had seduced the entire Eastwood staff. Others swore she was working with someone on the outside. A few even believed she had cursed the place. It wasn't just gossip, it was fear. And fear in prison spreads fast. What little control the administration had began to unravel. Unit lockdowns became more frequent. Yard time was slashed. The cafeteria was converted into an impromptu meeting room for investigators. Tamara was removed from general population and placed in medical isolation. Still, there were no answers. The infected officers were officially under investigation. Unofficially, they were pariahs. Rumors swirled that one of them had confessed. Another was being pressured to talk. A third, according to an overheard phone call, had hired a lawyer and stopped cooperating entirely. Tamara's name, once just another line in a prisoner logbook, was now the most whispered word in the facility. But despite all the chaos around her, she remained quiet, unbothered. She didn't request a transfer. She didn't file complaints. She just waited outside the prison. The media got wind of the outbreak. At first, it was just local outlets reporting on internal misconduct. But when a leaked memo hinted that a female inmate had knowingly infected multiple correctional officers with HIV, the story exploded. National headlines began calling Eastwood the infected prison. Reporters parked outside the gates. Family members of both inmates and guards began demanding answers. Lawsuits were filed. Civil rights groups got involved. And for the first time in Eastwood's history, the Department of Corrections ordered a full-scale audit. The warden, visibly strained, issued a short statement denying institutional failure. He promised cooperation. But behind the scenes, panic had set in. No one knew how deep Tamara's manipulation went, or whether there were more victims. The infected officers weren't speaking publicly. Some had gone into hiding. One, according to court documents, had been admitted for psychiatric evaluation after a failed suicide attempt. Within the prison, tensions between staff and inmates reached a boiling point. Officers became colder, more aggressive. Cell inspections doubled. Privileges were revoked without cause. Inmates who had once seen Tamara as untouchable now began blaming her for the backlash. One inmate said, "We all got punished for what she did." Another said, "She infected the guards, but now they're punishing us." In the middle of it all, Tamara remained silent. When a medical officer attempted to confront her, she said only one thing: "You should be asking why they let me do it." And maybe that was the most chilling part of all. She hadn't broken in. She hadn't used force. She walked through the front doors, signed her name, and used charm and patience to orchestrate the collapse of one of Texas's most guarded institutions. Internal affairs interviews revealed just how far things had slipped. Some guards admitted to looking the other way. Others confessed to covering for their colleagues because they didn't want to embarrass the unit. A few described Tamara as dangerous in a way you don't see until it's too late. By the end of the third week, the prison resembled less of a facility and more of a containment zone. Medical screenings were mandatory. Inmate complaints skyrocketed. Visitors were cut off indefinitely. But despite all the new rules, one thing remained unchanged. Tamara Fields was still alive, still calm, still holding the prison hostage without lifting a finger. Until she wasn't. On the 26th day of her incarceration, a nurse reported that Tamara hadn't responded during her morning wellness check. She was found lying on her cot in the isolation unit. No signs of trauma. No defensive wounds. No suicide note. She was declared dead at 7:42 a.m. Toxicology reports would later show an unusual mix of antiretroviral medications in her system, none of which she had been prescribed. It was ruled an overdose. Officials claimed she somehow obtained the drugs through a smuggled source. But how she did it, from isolation, under round-the-clock supervision, remains unexplained. Her death only deepened the crisis. Without Tamara, the investigation stalled. The guard she had infected stopped cooperating entirely. Lawsuits were filed against the state, the prison, and the warden. 2 of the infected officers moved out of state. Another was later charged with attempting to bribe a fellow guard to erase surveillance footage. And the inmates? They were left with a memory, a story, a legend. Tamara Fields had arrived at Eastwood as just another inmate. No one had expected her to make history. No one imagined she'd turn the prison upside down with nothing but her presence. And no one, not even the officers who once lingered outside her cell, could explain why they let her in so easily or why, once she got inside, no one stopped her. By the time it was over, 5 lives were changed forever. 1 was lost, and Eastwood would never be the same again. The morning of Tamara Fields' death began like any other inside Eastwood Correctional Facility, gray, silent, and tightly controlled. At 7:15 a.m., a nurse pushed open the steel door to Tamara's isolation unit, clipboard in hand. Her steps echoed against concrete walls as she approached Cell 3B, Tamara's cell. She knocked. No response. She knocked again, harder this time, and peered inside. Tamara was lying motionless on the narrow cot, facing the wall. Her body was still, too still. The nurse's gut clenched, her fingers hesitating as she reached for the emergency call button. Within 2 minutes, 2 correctional officers rushed in. One called for medical backup. The other unlocked the cell. What they found inside was chilling. Tamara's skin was pale, her limbs loose, her breathing absent. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted. On the small metal desk sat a plastic cup, empty. A half-folded napkin lay beside it. Nothing else appeared out of place. By 7:42 a.m., Tamara Fields was pronounced dead. Word spread fast, faster than usual. The facility's usual cold efficiency turned frantic. Officers whispered in corners. The medical unit locked down. Warden Lowell was notified immediately, and less than an hour later, a black unmarked van from the state coroner's office entered through the back gate. Inside the isolation wing, everything was put under review. Logs, surveillance footage, medication records, and staff rotations, all of it placed under a microscope. But very quickly it became clear. Something didn't add up. Tamara had been under constant surveillance. She wasn't permitted visitors. She had no access to medication, phones, or mail. She was on a restricted diet, monitored vitals, and a strict observation schedule every 6 hours. So how, under such close watch, had she died of what the toxicology report later described as a deliberate overdose of antiretroviral drugs she was never prescribed? The coroner's report listed a deadly combination of efavirenz, lamivudine, and zidovudine, a potent mix used in HIV treatment. Tamara had not been given any of them by prison medical staff. They weren't in her chart, weren't recorded in her logs, and weren't missing from any monitored stock. Yet, somehow, they were in her system. An internal inquiry was launched, but few believed it would lead anywhere. Eastwood had a history of protecting itself before protecting the truth, and when it came to Tamara Fields, the stakes were too high to allow a scandal to fully emerge. Even the prison's own staff started questioning the story. "How did she get those meds?" one correctional officer asked. "She was on 24-hour lockdown. The only people who saw her were staff." Another whispered, "They're trying to clean this up fast. Too fast." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, quiet pressure mounted from higher up. The Department of Corrections released a 2-sentence statement. An inmate housed at Eastwood Correctional Facility died on the morning of March 17th. The cause of death is under investigation. No foul play is suspected. But those inside the walls knew better. Tamara's death wasn't just suspicious. It was strategic. Just days before she died, word had spread that she was finally talking. According to one nurse's report, Tamara had requested a written statement form. When asked why, she allegedly replied, "It's time someone knew what really happened here." The form was never found. No copy was made. The nurse who filed the report later denied the interaction occurred at all. That same week, 3 officers who had been previously infected were called back for re-interviews. Internal Affairs wanted more details on their interactions with Tamara, who saw her last, who had unrecorded access, and what, if anything, she had told them privately. One of those officers, according to an anonymous tip, had begun cooperating with an attorney outside the prison system. Then Tamara died. To some, it looked like a coincidence. To others, it looked like silencing. Even inmates began voicing their suspicions. A woman in the same unit where Tamara had previously been held said she heard raised voices from the isolation hallway the night before Tamara was found dead. She was arguing with someone. The inmate said, "It didn't sound like medical staff. It sounded like one of the guards." That detail never made it into the official record. The camera system in the isolation wing reportedly malfunctioned the night of Tamara's death. Footage from midnight to 6 a.m. was missing, deleted due to what the administration claimed was a system-wide storage failure. There was no backup, no video, no audio, just a blank gap in the timeline, and a dead woman with drugs she should never have been able to access. By the time Tamara's body was released to the state coroner's office, the narrative had already been scrubbed. Her file was marked case closed. No autopsy results were made public. Her cause of death was recorded as complications from self-administered medication. There was no mention of foul play, no inquest, no accountability. But the people who had known her, guards, inmates, medical techs, were left with a single, chilling question. Did Tamara kill herself, or was she killed before she could speak? One officer who'd worked in the medical wing during her stay said something strange happened in the days leading up to her death. She'd stopped eating. Not completely, but enough to raise concerns. She wasn't combative. She didn't complain. She was just quiet. She looked like someone waiting, the officer recalled, like she knew something was coming. If Tamara Fields had been planning her own death, she didn't leave a message. No final words. No notes. No closure. Only a gap in surveillance, a fatal dosage, and a long list of unanswered questions. Some believe she took her secrets to the grave, intentionally. Others believe she was silenced by someone who couldn't afford her to talk. But everyone agrees on one thing. Her death wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a deeper, darker truth. Here is Section 5, The Unanswered Questions, written in a suspenseful, emotionally intense, narrative-driven style, around 800 words. The dust had barely settled over Eastwood Correctional Facility when the public began asking what the prison had tried so hard to bury. News of Tamara Fields' sudden death had trickled out under carefully worded statements, but the contradictions quickly began to multiply. The deeper anyone looked, the more tangled it became. And yet, no one had any clear answers, only questions, and they were multiplying. Who brought Tamara the medication that ended her life? How did she get her hands on a fatal mix of antiretrovirals that were supposedly under lock and key? No one could explain it. No missing meds were reported from the pharmacy. No medical staff admitted to any mistakes. No fellow inmates had contact with her. The wing was under surveillance. Her every move should have been accounted for. But it wasn't. Even the timeline didn't add up. Tamara had been alive during the last 6 a.m. wellness check. By 7:15, she was cold. That meant she had just over an hour to consume a lethal dose, process it through her system, and go unresponsive, all while being observed. And yet, no one had seen a thing. Not a handoff. Not a visitor. Not a clue. And what about the cameras? Footage from the isolation block that night was conveniently missing. According to prison administrators, the storage system suffered a technical error that wiped 6 hours of data. It just so happened to be the exact 6 hours surrounding Tamara's death. That kind of system failure? Rare, practically impossible. But the explanation was accepted, quietly without protest. Why? That led to another question, perhaps the most uncomfortable one of all. Who had the most to lose if Tamara Fields had lived? By the time of her death, 5 officers had tested positive for HIV. Each claimed unknowing exposure. Each swore she never told them of her condition. But Tamara was reportedly preparing a written statement before she died, a letter that never surfaced. If she had planned to reveal the truth, or worse, implicate someone else who silenced her. Had she acted alone in her bizarre scheme to seduce and infect? Or were others complicit? Officers, perhaps, who looked the other way, accepted favors, and crossed lines they couldn't come back from? No one was ever charged. No one was suspended. No criminal case was opened. That raised another issue. Why did the state seem so eager to move on? Despite the clear red flags, missing footage, untraceable medication, sudden death, there was no public inquest, no grand jury, no independent investigation. The coroner's office closed the file within weeks. The Department of Corrections gave its final word in just a few lines. Tragic, isolated, unpreventable. But the staff didn't believe that. Neither did the public. Because the unanswered questions didn't stop with Tamara's death. What about the infected guards? Why did they all vanish from public record? David Carver, the officer with the longest contact history with Tamara, moved out of state immediately after his resignation. His forwarding address was never listed. Crews retired early and stopped taking calls from reporters. Whitlow was rumored to have been hospitalized, but no medical documentation was ever released. All 3 had given conflicting stories about their relationships with Tamara. None of them were ever formally interviewed again. And the warden, why did he step down without warning? His exit came less than 2 months after Tamara's death, citing personal reasons. His deputy followed soon after. Their sudden departure left a leadership vacuum that was filled quietly, without ceremony or explanation. In fact, it seemed like everyone connected to Tamara wanted to disappear. Was it fear or guilt? There's also the matter of the lawsuit, the one filed by an inmate rights organization that accused the prison of gross negligence. That suit ended in a sealed settlement, with no details released to public, no terms, no reforms, just silence bought and paid for, which leaves the rest of us with nothing but speculation. Some believe Tamara was murdered, silenced before she could expose a wider network of corruption inside Eastwood. Others believe she orchestrated her own death, her final act of control, in a place that had tried to cage her. A few even suggest there was a larger conspiracy involving multiple officers, and Tamara was a scapegoat who became too dangerous to leave alive. No theory can be proven. No version can be confirmed. Because everyone who might know the truth has disappeared, resigned, or died, the prison still operates. The records remain sealed. The answers, whatever they are locked behind bureaucratic doors and broken chains of custody. All that